So I was sitting here trying to think of a optimistic flip to this, and one thing that you said struck me. I hadn't thought about it before, but essentially, why are all the exogenous shocks always negative? Why are there not very often do we get a positive exogenous shock? and that led me to think about the movie Shakespeare in Love, where Woods, the non-Shakespearean character, but the play manager for Shakespeare, is constantly, his backers are constantly putting his feet in the coals and putting hot irons against his feet and asking him how he's going to ever make any profits off these ridiculous plays by Shakespeare. And he keeps saying, I don't know. It's all going to work out. It's a mystery, but it always works out. And so in a sense, your ending is a little bit, if people respond endogenously, maybe it'll all work out. And I was struck by a recent Wall Street Journal editorial, and I'm curious to your thoughts about this, which basically said, it's a mystery, but it's all going to work out, and it's all going to work out because of technological innovation, micro-manufacturing, and we live in a world, you talk about aging population, and fortunately that's not about you and me, but we live in an aging population, but the technological change that is going on in the world around us is absolutely staggering, to me at least. And the micro-manufacturing techniques are just incomprehensible. They're now talking, you can now get you can get a machine to print out at your desk. You can create and produce machines at your desk and have it come out. And they're talking now about the possibility of making invisible machines. So do you see the potential that not financial innovation, but actual real world manufacturing innovation can take us out of some of these issues and launch us into a new age of economic growth?
Now, I don't know if this is the appropriate moment to suggest that my allegiance may have shifted to the Washington Nationals. But I think they have an awfully good shot.
Okay, that's the answer to my question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So don't call me pessimistic.
All right, so. Okay, anybody else want to take a shot?
No, I do want to say something about that. For sure, what I said was, here are the very clear, visible, near-term challenges. And frankly, once again, we don't want to ignore it. We are facing what has been a notable rise in energy prices, even in the context in which you can step back and say, in the medium term, one of the fantastic news is the apparent move in the U.S., despite, I don't know if it's because of more likely, despite government regulation, towards energy independence, or at least a much more favorable outlook for domestic energy that over the medium term would reduce these kinds of vulnerabilities. But I agree with you that certainly, and of all places here, we recognize the importance of and prospects of technological change in improving productivity growth. After all, that is perhaps for the U.S. economy, one of the most notable developments was the acceleration in productivity growth in the mid-1990s associated with technological advances. And I'd like to think that that's not over. But it will require, as we know, as students of Paul David know, that the way you get productivity improvements is by actually making the investment and installing the new equipment. And hence, it's not just ideas, but it's the actual implementation of ideas. And as a result, the productivity change that you imply coming from technology requires investment, and that requires economic stability and progress, and so it can't be taken for granted. So I'm a substantial optimist. After all, as I said, the past 60 years have been, by historical standards, an amazing period, and there's no reason why it shouldn't continue. But it still strikes me we shouldn't take it for granted, and recognize it is going to require decisions, and it's require attention to make sure we create the environment in which those advances can produce the progress we hope.
Okay. Questions and answers from the audience. This is the first time we'll do this today, but when I recognize you, someone will run over to you with a microphone, so wait till you get the microphone to ask your question. Any Questions? Back here in the way back corner.
Yeah, John, you said that one of your concerns was the adequacy of international economic institutions to cope with this, the stress of this global recession that we've experienced. If you were the economic czar and you could have your own way, what types of structures would you recommend that the globe institute?
Thank you. Well, we could look at this in a number of ways. What has been done and what needs to be continued. First and foremost is, I would say, the problems need to be recognized adequately, and then something done about it. How is that being done? I'll just pick at a specific instance at an international level. At the London summit of the G20, as I described, we all remember back that a moment of broad-scale agreement by policymakers on what needed to be done and substantial, coherent action, including, among other things, if you remember, $1 trillion in new resources for the IMF, agreement on fiscal action, monetary action, etc. And I think we all look back and feel that that action was an important element that pulled the global economy out of recession as early as the second quarter of 2009 and created much greater optimism about the outlook. In September 2009 meeting in Pittsburgh, the G20 created, recognizing that collective action had produced results and recognizing that the economy seemed to be recovering, sought to sustain that format of coherent and collective, coherent policymaking, and created really the initiative sponsored by the Obama administration of what they called the Framework for Strong, Sustainable, and Balanced Growth. And within that produced something called the mutual assessment process, something that's generally not even recognized, or it's almost unknown. But since that time, at a deputy minister, deputy governor level, double deputies have been meeting periodically, quite frequently, to try to formulate a set of macroeconomic policies that fit together and would produce, on the one hand, sustain stronger growth and at the same time reduce the global imbalances that in most people's minds threatens the stability of the expansion. Politically, frankly, I think at that time, policymakers were looking forward and worried and anticipating exactly what, in a sense, what was going to happen, which is that the economies were going to recover, but the recovery was going to be substandard and unsatisfying. And they were looking for a way to sustain cooperation in hopes that they could produce a better outcome. Well, it seems to me that in 2011, the economies produced, with this combination of exogenous elements in early 2011, produced disappointing results, and now all the incumbents facing elections are being criticized for the poor economic outcomes. So there seems to have been a willingness to sort of back away from this G20 effort and say, well, we're all looking out for ourselves. Nobody seems to want to put stock in trying to work at these issues coherently in a situation which we all know that the crisis has just emphasized the degree of interconnectivity. This strikes me as both a mistake and a danger, that we will end up being forced, if the commitment of leaders to follow coherent macro policies as expressed through the mutual assessment process simply goes away, then I'm not trying to claim that that's a miracle, or that if implemented it would guarantee success or anything of the sort. But at least it would give confidence that, and would express that in a public way, that policies actually were working together. And oddly enough, there is, and in fact I've shown it here in years past, there is a matrix of policy actions that have been agreed among deficit countries, surplus countries, advanced economies, developing economies, emerging economies, as to what everybody needs to do, not the same thing at the same time, but coherent things at the same time. U.S., we all know, needs to attack its fiscal imbalances. China needs to rebalance its economy toward a greater reliance on domestic demand. The European economies need to implement structural reforms that will improve their potential growth. There's agreement on all this, but the notion of coherence and mutual support is leaching away, and I think that would be a mistake. In June, the G20 meets at Los Cabos in Mexico under the presidency of President Calderon, and I hope that there is a renewed sense of cooperation at this level that is expressed by leaders, but I fear that it will not be forthcoming, just as if you notice the Cannes summit in November failed to really project this notion of a willingness to take action and act in a coherent way.
Questions? Other questions? Yes? Okay.
What role, if any, do you think China will take in Europe's recovery?
China has expressed, as you probably know, there was a fair amount of talk and even some actions that made it look like somehow somebody was hoping that China was going to provide substantial financial resources to support European stabilization plans, let's put it that way. When you thought about it for a nanosecond, you realized how could a country with per capita income of $6,000, $7,000, maybe $9,000, depending on how you want to calculate it, $9,000 a year, be providing the financial muscle to underpin adjustment programs in an area where per capita income is $36,000 a year? The political logic always seemed to me to be a little weak. Why should a relatively poor country be providing the financial muscle to an area that is one of the wealthiest on earth? So what has happened is, you may be aware, the European authorities in principle have pledged about $1 trillion in new funding to support their own stabilization. Of course, there's always a difference between pledges and actually showing the money. They've also pledged an additional $300 billion towards expanding the resources of the IMF, not specifically to support Europe. The rest of the fund membership has expressed a willingness to support some additional resources for the fund, again, not specifically earmarked for Europe. And China has, although they haven't mentioned any figures, have said that they're willing to do their fair share in an international agreement to provide additional support for the IMF. Now, I should also point out that in the Seoul G20 summit, the G20 leaders agreed that by September 2012 they would implement and formally approve a set of new quota arrangements in the IMF that, among others, would substantially increase the voting power within the IMF of emerging developing economies, in effect. And that there would be a realignment at that time of the chairs, the 24 chairs of the executive board of the IMF, which today can have 8 of 24 are Europeans, and the Europeans would step back to 6, non-trivial. The self-defined goal was September 2012. Right now, it's not at all clear that that is going to be done. And you can imagine that this is just another indication of a weakening or apparent weakening of the resolve to carry through the institutional reforms that are needed to make things more effective. Because you can imagine, on the one hand, you might be asking China to increase their financial contributions, and on the other hand saying, but of course we're not able to meet the deadlines we set for ourselves in your favor.
Supportive of John's point, and I know Nick Pope is here, and there's probably any number of people who know this better than I do, but supportive of your point, did somebody jump up here? Is 3/4 of the Chinese population have less than a $500 per capita income? Something like that. Does somebody know that exact number? Okay, we'll go with my guesstimate then. Other questions? Yes, over here.
Yes, John, wonderful to see you and great review. John, some places it seems like there's structural stickiness, such as Syria. Other places there seem to be cultural stickiness, let's say retirement age or tax collection, or policy stickiness, such as in the U.S. with healthcare efficiency and reform. So with all the reluctance to change a certain past behavior, how do you see that going forward in the challenges that we face? Thank you so much.
Are you asking that more broadly or specifically in the MENA region?
Three. Those three in particular, but broadly is fine too.
Boy, those are good questions. I don't know if I have just a country economist. And obviously things have changed a lot, and I think the parable of the, if you will, of the MENA region is very instructive. Very instructive. Why has change occurred now? This is an area that has, as I described, been progressively falling behind economically, and the sources of that laggard performance seems to be very clear in diagnosis. And yet something happened over the last year that said, we can't take any more and change is coming. Will the change be effective is another question. But it seems remarkable that, and maybe it comes back to technology. Maybe it comes back to communication. Maybe it comes back to a much greater awareness of possibilities and awareness of how things are done elsewhere. Maybe that has contributed to a rise in expectations that is becoming much more effective. This is undoubtedly, and I think in the areas you describe, is undoubtedly not going to be a smooth path. But I take, contrary to the opening statement, I take these ultimately as very optimistic developments. But as my theme is obvious, we can't take it for granted, and we need to work to put in place the policies and the institutions that will guarantee progress.
Questions over here? Right here in the middle? Whoever's got jurisdiction, microphone jurisdiction in the middle here.
Thank you. If the near-term downside risks that you talk about with respect to Europe do materialize, what do you think the impact is going to be on the U.S. economy and the global economy?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me make clear why one of the reasons I'm both optimistic and hopeful that the actions taken to quell the crisis and put the European economy on a better footing are likely to succeed. And this is in the face of both significant risks and plenty of intelligent folks who are very skeptical about a successful outcome. And that is, come back to where I started on the euro area. And I will get to your question about how does it affect everybody, but I think the path is important here. When you come back to where I started, a perception that the single market was necessary for economic success of the euro area, or the European economy, the EU more broadly, and the conviction that was sufficient to get it done that a single currency was required to sustain a single market. At the outset, as I say, you could make very intelligent arguments that says that's nonsense. We have NAFTA. Nobody talks about the need for a currency union with Mexico and Canada. Seems to work pretty well. Headed for freer trade. But the important point is they decided they needed it. Now, today, could you undo the euro without threatening the single market? And it seems to me that the most likely avenue of threat would be, let's say it became possible, or people became convinced that countries could exit the euro, and in fact were going to exit the euro. one obvious response would be you would not want to keep your euro deposits in a bank domiciled in a country that was likely to leave the euro. Example, if you were a Greek depositor in a Greek bank with euros, you'd be worried that if you played things wrong, you would end up holding drastically depreciated drachma or some other currency and suffer big losses. So you'd take your money out of that bank. So if there were bank runs within the euro area because of fears of dissolution of the euro, rushing to safe havens, right now, remember I mentioned in financial sector reform resolution, there is no pan-European support mechanism for individual banking systems. The solidity of individual banks and banking systems is still the responsibility of national authorities. How would national authorities respond to a bank run within their borders? I think the risks are very significant. It would be capital controls. And if you, if you implement capital controls in the euro area, what happened to the single market? It's gone. It's gone. You will have balkanized the financial markets in Europe. So I think that's why I think you can make a much better case today that undoing the euro would threaten the single market than you could 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And I think that's recognized. And that's why I think when you're in those circumstances, you do what is required. As I put it, you're in Tina land. There is no alternative. You just do what you got to do. And I think that's what's going to happen. What would happen if that occurred to the U.S.? Not clear what the economic impact would be, but I can tell you, for example, the IMF, in its revised down global growth in their January 24th projections that I described to you earlier, revised down global growth by a little over between 0.5 and 0.75% for this year and next year, mainly because of the writing down of European growth. If you added on top of that real financial disorder stemming from Europe, it's hard to guess exactly how that plays out. You could try to pretend that it would produce safe haven flows back to the dollar or something like that, but I think it's a very complex bit of business, and I think the best advice is let's not go there.
Anybody over here have a question on this side?
Yes. Oh.
Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic.
Yes. John, you talked about the structural reforms needed in Europe, and I assume you talked primarily initially about competitive markets. Now, following up on your most recent response, does the European Union need more effective fiscal institutions, and can they be had? Central fiscal institutions, and can they be had?
Yes. Yes and yes. I think is the easy answer there. You've probably, or maybe you're familiar with the analogies that have been drawn by a former Stanford professor, Tom Sargent, in which he's compared the current state of the EU to the U.S. Articles of Confederation, and said that we're getting the same kind of problems in a way that plagued the lack of fiscal discipline within the colonies that afflicted the Confederation and produced the move towards the Constitution. And subsequently the assumption of, among other things, assumption of debts by Alexander Hamilton within the early U.S. government. I think that's a useful analogy. It certainly found echo in Europe. How do you get there? And that is not so simple, because as you know, or as you may know, one of the issues that keeps recurring in Europe is whether or not, for example, that the EU would issue bonds that were born collectively, so-called Euro bonds. Clearly, the German authorities have said we're in favor of that when a set of central fiscal institutions is in place that would effectively control the budgetary exposure of the individual countries. France, on the other hand, have suggested that they support a move to Euro bonds while retaining largely retaining national sovereignty. So as long as there is a fundamental disagreement among the two most important members of the euro area about how to move forward on governance, it's hard to envision rapid progress. Nonetheless, it seems to me that the fundamental message has been clear that without improved central fiscal institutions, it's hard to see how you can prevent or guarantee against a recurrence or perpetuation of the kind of strains that we see now. So I'm hopeful, but in the very near term, I have to say the politics doesn't point toward very rapid improvement because, again, forgive me for going into the weeds, but they're a new governance, the new fiscal governance that has been adopted in the so-called six-pack of reforms. You may have seen in the latest Euro summit, the UK has been unwilling to go along with the new proposed treaty, and therefore the new governance agreement that is intended to limit budget deficits, among other things, or improve budgetary discipline in individual countries is going to be a treaty signed by everybody in the EU but not the UK. So in an attempt to promote institutional coherence in the direction that you suggest, the result is, in a certain sense, increased incoherence. And this is in the context in which I'm sure that this was never imagined by the architects of Maastricht, that it is possible for the UK to be permanently inside the single market and permanently outside the single currency, which is an elemental incoherence that I think can't be sustained over the very long term.
Speaking of the UK, Tom Sargent and historians will note that one thing the colonies had that the Europeans don't currently have was a common enemy, and a very serious common enemy, which was the UK, and that facilitated that common currency area of the banking system. And once that enemy went away and you got to the mid-19th century, stresses started in the United States that led to serious stress.
But you called me the pessimist?
I'm a historical pessimist.
But it worked out okay, right?
So far so good. Yeah, if you live in Charleston, South Carolina half the year, no, it didn't work out so good for them. I'll exercise my prerogative as the moderator. I don't have a final question, but I do have a final forecast. Okay, my forecast is that when Theo Epstein takes the Cubs to their World Championship, we will discover at the following summit that this born-again Washington Nationals fan is suddenly a Chicago Cubs fan again. Thank you, John.